Okay, good evening. My name is Fred Lawrence, the director of the Lonergan Workshop, and it was in honor of our 30th anniversary that we're going to have a lot of speakers anyway. And then the President Leahy suggested or had the initiative for the Church in the 21st Century response at BC to the crisis in the church at the present time. And so I'm very happy that the last speaker in our series this year is Timothy Radcliffe. I wanted to point out to you this lovely book, which inspired me to invite him. And many of the pieces, there are many occasions on which he wrote, but many of the pieces are for Dominicans. And he's addressing crises that are present not only in the Dominicans, apparently, but in the church at large. And so, as he showed us today on our way in from the airport, Timothy has a 3 or 4 page single-spaced itinerary of a trip around the world he's making. And because we're at ground zero here of the church crisis, he squeezed us in. And so I wanted to also mention that you ought to get this book because it has many lovely passages. And one of the most beautiful ones is a passage where a person asks him about the Dominicans. And he takes off from St. Thomas's idea, that audacious idea that Thomas had to speak about grace in the Aristotelian terms of friendship. And friendship, as you know, is between equals. And people were avoiding to say that that's what grace means, that we're friends. But he said if you wanted to take all the different things that Dominicans stand for, it's friendship. And I just wanted to say that we're lucky to have a Dominican on our faculty, a permanent member of our faculty. And I would say certainly a distinguishing quality of Father Louis Waugh on our faculty is that he is a friend. And so I knew just what Timothy meant when he said that about Dominicans. And now we hope that we're all going to become his friends too. So welcome, Timothy, and thank you.
I hope I could just offer a little word of explanation at the beginning, is that on the plane over I caught a bit of flu. So that if I appear incomprehensible, if you can't see the logical connection of what I'm saying, put it down to the flu. If I go to sleep, wake me up, put it down to the flu. It's very, very useful to get the flu. Actually, it reminds me of a cabinet minister who at the beginning of the last century said that he dreamt that he was addressing the House of Lords and then woke up to find that he was doing so. I hope this won't be my experience today. Today I'd like to share a few reflections about the crisis in the church. And I feel like, as we say in English, I don't know whether you say it in the States, I feel like a child teaching its grandmother to suck eggs. You've lived through this crisis much more dramatically than we have in Britain. I'm sure you've reflected upon it much more profoundly. In England, we've suffered something of the same traumas. Accusations against the clergy for the abuse of minors and of bishops for covering up these incidents. It's not been so severe with us because right at the beginning, the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster appointed a commission of lay people chaired by a senior judge, Lord Nolan, to lay down the guidelines which the bishops accepted and which they have largely implemented. So this meant that the relationship between the hierarchy and the people of God was never broken. The trust was never destroyed. So I don't really know your experience. In fact, I hesitated to speak about it, but Fred and Sue encouraged me. And so I consoled myself with the memory of one of my brethren who gave a lecture in the States, and when he sat down, the applause was a little bit tepid. So he turned to the man beside him and he said, it wasn't that bad, was it? And the man said, it's not you I blame, it's the people who invited you to speak I blame. When you're talking about sexual abuse and all that, you've got to get the jokes in quickly because there aren't many afterwards. It seems obvious that this is a crisis basically about power. Luke Timothy Johnson wrote, "The crisis in the church caused by the sexual abuse of children by clergy will not quickly disappear, because the crisis is not about sex so much as about the abuse of power. Priests who use their position to sexually seduce or assault young people abuse their power. Bishops who hid these crimes and placed priests where they could continue their predatory behaviour abused their power." So if you have this small minority of priests who committed these crimes, you can't blame it on celibacy. You can't blame it primarily on the high percentage of gay priests. These are not the issues, I think. The issues are sexual and emotional immaturity. Some priests have been unable to form relationships with people who are their equals. And so they have to find the invulnerability of relationships with people over whom they have power. And I think the same issues are touched upon, really, in relationship with the hierarchy. To prepare myself for this lecture, I flicked through the last 2 years of America. And what you found was time and time again, it was the issue of accountability. Why isn't the hierarchy accountable to the people of God? It's the anger at an unaccountable authority. In fact, Boston seems to be the place where this is often an issue. I seem to remember the Boston Tea Party. No taxation without representation. Let's hope that the Universal Church is a bit more responsive than the British monarchy. I'm not asserting that there's a simple relationship between this abusive behaviour and the structures of the church, because the vast majority of priests and bishops, in my experience, of most countries in the world, is that they don't exercise power in an abusive way. There's usually a profound respect for the dignity of the people of God. And yet, these institutional structures mean that priests who are emotionally or sexually immature aren't necessarily challenged into maturity. So it can provide a shelter from the demanding relationships of equality. So the crisis is a crisis of power. But paradoxically, it's also a crisis, I would suggest, of powerlessness. Because the other complaint you see, just as an outsider, one of these strange foreigners, looking through American newspapers and America, is that there is a crisis of leadership. This is the most profound crisis that the church in the United States has ever lived through. There's an enormous desire to move on and transcend it, and yet people speak of helplessness. Bishops seem paralyzed, caught between the Vatican and the media, Priests appear to be powerless because of the lack of leadership of the bishops. And the people of God feel powerless because the institution in no way empowers them. It's almost as if you have a structure which many people experience as mediating powerlessness. Of course, there are small signs of hope, very important initiatives like the Voice of the Faithful, and some initiatives of the priests of the Archdiocese. But you have this paradox of a simultaneous experience of abusive power and powerlessness. Now, in the next 40 minutes or so, what I want to do is look at three questions, each of them very superficially. As always, you've got the sketch of a book rather than a closely argued hypothesis. What does the New Testament teach us about this experience of power and powerlessness? Secondly, how do we get where we are, very, very briefly? And thirdly, what's the way forward? Now, when I drafted this lecture about 4 weeks ago, I thought I'd really got it all sussed out. When I lay on the bed this afternoon to read it through, I realized I hadn't at all. And I think what I will end up by doing is less really answering that question this time, perhaps the next time, is more trying to locate the whole question differently. But we'll see. So what does the New Testament teach us about this crisis of power and powerlessness? It's very reassuring to see that the church was born in a crisis of powerlessness. At the Last Supper, you see Jesus losing control of his life. It all goes to bits. One disciple sells him. Another disciple, the rock, is about to deny him. The rest will flee. He'll be taken a prisoner. He'll be handed over to humiliation and death. So the church is born in an experience of powerlessness, a crisis of power. It's in this context that Jesus actually performs the most powerful gesture of the whole life of the church, which is that he takes bread and breaks it and gives it to the disciples, and he says, "This is my body, which is given for you. This is the blood of the new covenant." And I think that this teaches us two things. The first thing is that we don't need to be afraid of crises. The church was born in a crisis. Every enactment of the Last Supper is in memory of him and in memory of a crisis endured and transcended. If you look at the history of the church, it is always renewed and revitalized, rejuvenated by crisis. The next big crisis was actually, I think, about 40 years after the Last Supper, when Jesus failed to turn up. All those early Christians were convinced of the imminent return of Jesus. And when the apostles started to die, he must be around the corner. And when the church was persecuted in Rome and the Christians began to betray each other, surely Christ must be nigh. And when the Christ failed to come, I think that that was a crisis whose dimensions we could hardly begin to imagine. Far worse than anything that we are enduring today. But it led to the birth of the New Testament. We would never have heard of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John if it hadn't been that the church had to struggle to understand those terrible years. So, okay, we got a crisis. It's our little crisis. It's not such a big one if you look at the history of the church. But if we can live it with faith and hope, then it will be fertile. The second thing is that Jesus' act of power lay in the meaning of what he said and did. Jesus' power always lies at the level of significance. It is, he performs what we would later call a sacramental act, which is to say, a symbolic act, which is powerful because of what it says. As St. Thomas Aquinas said, and with several Dominicans I can see in the audience, I better get him in as quickly as possible. Sacraments are in genere signi. Sacraments belong to the genus of signs. They're powerful in virtue of their meaning. And that's why, traditionally in the church, power, potestas, jurisdiction, has actually been linked, for better or for worse, and often I must admit for worse, to the sacramental system. Because Christian power is inseparable from what it says. All Christian power should be sacramental. According to all the Abrahamic religions, God spoke a word and the world came to be. Or as Maximus the Confessor said, God created the world through the immeasurable force of wisdom. Now this is a very hard conception for our society to understand. Because for the last few hundred years, our communal imagination has been captured by what you might call a mechanical understanding of power. Power, for us, largely equals force. It's the power of steam, which produced the Industrial Revolution that made Britain wealthy. Steam, electricity, nuclear power, these are the models of power which dominate, especially, I think you might say, our British and American imaginations. So often, when we've thought about God as the mechanic, God as the clockmaker. And that meant that the traditional Catholic idea of power as fundamentally sacramental has become hard for us to understand. It sounds like something in our heads, you know? Ideas, rather than anything in the real world. For us, power is the imposition of our wills. As you can see in the foreign policies of both the British and the American empires. But our world, it is at a turning point. The old world of the industrial market was founded on the production and distribution of goods. And that's passing away. We're entering a new world, which is where what's actually exchanged are mainly information, signs, and symbols. We're members of what's becoming called the semiotic society, a symbol-saturated society. So what zings around the World Wide Web isn't so much heavy things. I see my brother Scott there, who knows 20 times more about internet and all that than I do. He seems to be approving anyway. It's not heavy things like coal and steel. What zooms around the World Wide Web are symbols. Above all, money. So we live in a world where I think that sacramental understanding of power may well become more comprehensible, actually. I think that our contemporaries and maybe our descendants or the young already, will understand better a Catholic understanding of power than our parents. Unfortunately, as a church, as usual, we're rather slow at getting the point. Just think of September the 11th. That was a dreadful and incomparably awful event, primarily on the level of symbolism. It was planned and executed as a symbolic event, with those symbols of modernity, jet aeroplanes, crashing into the symbols of Western economic and military power. That's why I think in the end you can only really reply to it symbolically. Now, if Christian power is primarily sacramental, significant, then it means that of its nature it cannot be unaccountable. It belongs to its nature that it gives an account of itself, because it's part of the speaking of a word of grace. A brute act of power, which took refuge in authority, would not only be unchristian, but also, according to Catholic tradition, ineffectual. And I think that this is one reason why we are actually suffering that paradoxical combination of an experience of abusive power and powerlessness at the same time. If it doesn't speak, it doesn't work. As Nicholas Lash said, and it was Nicholas who said, "Oh, you've got to go to Boston." Governance in the church is actually part of teaching, set from the start to finish at the service of our common apprenticeship in holiness and understanding. Discipleship is always the initiation into learning. So, the exercise of authority and of power in the church necessarily implies the engagement of our hearts and minds. There's no teaching, there's no act of Christian power unless there is understanding. And this implies the asking of questions, the demanding of explanation, the raising of objections, the sharing of experience, the testing of arguments. Teaching is a process in which those who are learning must be actively engaged, otherwise there is no teaching. As Thomas Aquinas said, this is the last quote I think you'll get from him, "If the master decides a question simply by using sheer authority, the hearer will certainly be left in no doubt that such and such is the case. But he will acquire no knowledge or understanding, and he will go away empty." So a passive reception of authority is actually intrinsically unchristian. Now, as some of my brethren will know, I spent almost 20 uninterrupted years as prior, provincial, master of the order, and I sometimes took decisions, I'm sure, which my brethren found deeply incomprehensible. I tried to give an account of what I was doing, but I'm sure I often failed, and sometimes they must have thought that I was nuts. No thank you, no reactions to that, please. But in our tradition, to obey without understanding is not a good example of obedience. It's not obedience at its best. I don't know about the Jesuit tradition. We would never say, "Oh, isn't Brother Louis a wonderful example of an obedient brother? He planted all those cabbages upside down without asking why." For us, that would be an example of the failure of obedience, of proper obedience. As Herbert McCabe, an English Dominican, wrote, "Obedience only becomes perfect when the one who commands and the one who obeys come to share one mind. The notion of blind obedience makes no more sense in our tradition than would blind learning. A truly obedient community will be one in which no one was ever compelled to do anything. So what does this tell us about the ordained priesthood, the clerical system? It shows that, first of all, it cannot be a class of people who are unanswerable to the people of God. Because the whole priesthood is at the service of the Word. And that is a word of grace. And so answering, giving account of who we are and what we've done, what we do, should be an intrinsic part of our priesthood. Secondly, at the Last Supper, you can see that the idea of holiness, which we find in the Old Testament, is turned upside down. Whereas the Old Testament idea of holiness was founded on God's separation from all that is unholy, impure, defective, especially the sick, above all the dead. The New Testament idea of holiness is founded on God's embrace of all that's farthest, all that's unholy, all that's imperfect. It overthrows divisions. It eliminates separation. So you can see that the idea of a separate caste of unaccountable people is remote from the New Testament. My favorite example of what God's holiness looks like, which I've often referred to, is a funeral I did when I was a young, well, not that young, 1982 it was, priest of a young guy called Benedict. Benedict asked me, I anointed him, and just before he died, he asked me if I would bury him from Westminster Cathedral. Well, that would have been a bit of a challenge, only it was 1982 and Benedict was dying of AIDS. At the time when everybody thought that if you went within 100 miles, somebody with AIDS, you'd collapse and die on the spot. But we got it. And so his coffin was there at the centre of the church, the central church of Catholicism in England and Wales. Somebody suffering from 3 forms of exclusion. He had AIDS, he was gay, and he was dead. But he was at the centre. And that's what God's holiness looks like. It gathers in all that's far away into the centre. Now, some of you may have noticed a little dissonance between the image that I've been presenting from the New Testament and what we experience today. Even Fred does. Faced with this gap, how are we to react? It would be very tempting just to blame it on 2,000 years of power-hungry clerics who've betrayed the original purity of the gospel. All we have to do is return to the New Testament and all will be well. Forget 2,000 years of failure and betrayal. It's tempting, but it would be highly naive and also unjust. Of course, the church is always renewed by returning to the gospel. The gospel always challenges the church. But during those 2,000 years, the Holy Spirit has not been on holidays. She didn't appear at Pentecost and then disappear again. If she had done, what grounds would we have for thinking we'd do any better? Somehow, in the evolution of the church, as it has come to be, we have to find clues that will teach us more deeply about the meaning of Christian power and powerlessness. the Christian sacramental power, if it's always part of the preaching of the gospel, it's always part of the articulation of meaning, all that is said and done should speak of grace. But this never happens in a vacuum. Christian power is always exercised in the context of the powers of this world, in some ways conforming to them, and in other ways becoming against them. It's simultaneously inculturated and countercultural. So our beloved Mother Church, as we know her, with the power structures that shape her, is the fruit of 2 millennia of inculturation and counterculturation. The trouble is that one person's inculturation is another person's betrayal, and one person's counterculturation is a third's unrealism. So what I'm trying to say, I think this is only slowly dawning on me, is that if you want to look at power in the church, it is not enough to look at the relationships of the Vatican, bishops, priests, and the laity. You have to do that, of course, and I hope you've done it a lot, but that's not enough. You also have to reflect upon the context in which these relationships are incarnate, the powers that rule our society. If you don't do that, I'm afraid we will end up with solutions which are rather naive. I'm not a church historian. My impression that all the institutions which are contested at the moment in the process of this crisis evolved under that dual pressure of the church to conform to the powers of different societies and to resist them. Centralized institution of the Vatican, the naming of bishops by Rome, a celibate clergy. Sure, all of these were in part driven by the desire for clerical power. You can't deny that. But it's much more complex. They're also the fruit of a history of resistance to other institutions which have tried to take over the church and deprive it of its freedom to speak. 2,000 years of collusion and collision. The battle against Roman imperial persecution, Christian empires, the feudal aristocracy, the Holy Roman Empire, the rise of absolutist monarchies from the 17th century onwards, the French Revolution, the great 19th century empires, communism, fascism. So the church is like an old warrior which bears the scars of all those battles and which often comes to look like the forces it's opposed. If the papacy looks so much like a monarchy, it's because it spent 1,500 years fighting kings. If the Vatican has been compared to the Kremlin, it's because for the last 100 years, who is the big enemy? So, it's my guess that for the church to be free and countercultural in our history, in the past, later we'll think about the future, but in the past, there have been 4 institutions which have been considered key. 2 are contested, 1 has disappeared, and the other is dangerously weak in the West. I'd love to have a little competition, but we haven't got time. First of all, the evolution of a centralized church, Roman bureaucracy, with the naming of bishops by Rome. That's been a battle that has been fought to and fro ever since Constantine. First battle occurs, I think, about 4 years after Constantine's conversion. The low point was probably the beginning of the 19th century. I think, if I remember correctly, and I think in 1829, of the 646 dioceses in the church, 555 were appointed by the states around the world. the Pope could only appoint 24 bishops in Russia, Greece, and Albania. 100 years later, the Code of Canon Law was published, the one before last. He was claiming to name all the bishops. Secondly, the celibacy of the clergy. That was very importantly seen as an island of resistance to secular power, the feudal aristocracy, particularly at the time of the Gregorian reform in the 11th century, when the barons and the monarchs were trying to gobble up the dioceses and their wealth, and the abbeys. It was celibacy, above all the monks from Cluny, hard, strong-line celibates who wouldn't get entangled with marriage and dynasty. They wouldn't bequeath their diocese to their sons or their abbesses either. Celibacy was this great island of resistance of a church that wished to be free. Thirdly, for most of the history of the church, the other great island of freedom. Any guesses? Papal states. For most of the history of the church, it was inconceivable that the church could be free without the Pope's temporal power. Henry Manning, future Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, declared that the temporal power of the Pope was a sign of the freedom, the independence, the sovereignty of the kingdom of God on earth. The papal states were the only spot of ground on which the vicar of Christ can set his foot in freedom. Well, he turned out to be wrong. Because what we're looking at, you see, I think what the issues that I'm rather inadequately trying to address this evening is how in new societies you have to rethink what are the contexts for Christian power. The fourth one was, I already referred to celibacy of the clergy. The fourth one was religious life. We've seen the Gregorian reform, how vital that was. The Mendicant friars, of course, in the 13th century with their embrace of poverty, and with the rise of the absolutist monarchies from the 16th century onwards, with the immense demands of obedience that they put on their people, then Jesuit obedience was the church's bulwark in reply. So what I'm trying to suggest is, okay, we're going to turn in just a couple of seconds to try to think our way through to the future. But let's be Manichaean. Don't look at the church as if it's somehow floating in the air, a separate sphere, and that we can solve these issues by looking just at internal church relationships. That we must do. That, I hope, is what you have been doing. So it's not going to be my priority tonight. We've got to look at the world in which we are to be incarnate as a church of power, evangelical gospel power. Otherwise, this isn't incarnate. It's docetic. Now, if Christian power is always fundamentally sacramental, significant, then it requires what Habermas calls undistorted communication, which is to say communication which is not deformed by injustice, domination, or exclusion. It's obvious that the most massive form of exclusion within the church is that of women. In a way, it's so obvious, so massive, so extraordinary, and so frequently discussed that I won't focus on it, because that would be a whole lecture. Instead, I want to look at some of the distortions of communication which are perhaps less often recognized. If the church has a highly centralized power structure, then, as I said, it's because it's been trying to carve out areas, oases of cultural freedom in resistance to other centralized powers, from the Roman Empire to the Soviet Empire. What are the structures of power within which we must live and move and be free? Have we left behind the need for centralized government? I would say yes and no. We're entering the new age of the World Wide Web. Here, power operates in an entirely different way. It's not centralized, it's multifocal. It doesn't work through rigid hierarchies, but through horizontal networks. As Lash and Urey write, we've moved from place to flow, from space to stream, from organized hierarchies to disorganization. To be empowered in this society is to be linked to the web. As Jeremy Rifkin wrote, the gap between the possessed and the dispossessed is wide, but the gap between the connected and the disconnected is even wider. The great divide in the coming age is between those whose lives are increasingly taken up in cyberspace and those who will never have access to this new powerful realm of human existence. This, I hope you're listening to this, Fred, because I know that you're not very keen on internet, is this basic schism which will determine much of the political struggle in the years to come. Now, this brave new world implies a rethink about how power operates in the church. In many ways, it's much more hospitable to the church. I've already argued that it's more receptive to a sacramental understanding of power, where power is linked to concepts and symbols and information, communication. Its horizontal networks are much more hospitable to a Catholic understanding of the church as a communion of local churches. The World Wide Web is much more receptive of a Trinitarian understanding of the church. There's relationships of equality, horizontal, than a monarchical idea. You remember the Genghis Khan? When somebody challenged the Genghis Khan for his brutal way of ruling the world and tolerating no opposition, he said, there is one God in heaven. He rules the heavens. And there is one Genghis Khan on earth, and he rules in his place down here. So this centralized system of the church's government often actually reflects monarchical moments in our history which aren't actually so receptive to Trinitarian ways of thought. And the church, I think, shouldn't only flourish in the World Wide Web. We're actually even more global than the village. Don't forget, we live in a world where estimates vary, between 40 and 65% of all human beings have never ever used a telephone. And I bet you not one of those is in the room tonight. I think that part of the crisis of power in the church is that our structures of power reflect a past moment, a society which is largely passed away, where power operated vertically through centralized hierarchies. And that's just not how it works these days, mainly in the big bad world. We're like knights of armor stumbling around while the modern infantry zip around with little pistols. But it would be naive to give the impression that the World Wide Web is an innocent space in which the church may flourish, freed from monarchs and emperors. It's a field that has its own areas of distortion. And we have to understand these if we're going to imagine the renewal of the church and what power and powerlessness might properly mean. And these are, well, I will name three interrelated powers that still rule the cyber world to some extent. There are still some centralized states which are important. There's the power of money, and there is the power of the media. How can the church articulate a sacramental word of power in the face of these? So let's look at the states. A few strong states that threaten the freedom of the church, as they always have done from the beginning. China, home to more than a quarter of humanity. Vietnam, North Korea, Zimbabwe. In all these places, the church needs the strong support of the whole universal church if they are to exist. The authority of the Pope to name bishops remains very important still in some places if the church is to be free. The Chinese authorities understand this perfectly well. The establishment of the patriotic church was clearly designed to exclude any reference to the Pope, because that was the source of freedom the church to resist. The Pope understands it, having grown up in the Soviet Empire. So that old battle is not entirely over. But there is, to broach a more delicate subject for me as your guest, but luckily I'm leaving first thing tomorrow morning, there is one empire left, which is the United States. And both within and outside the States, there is a profound preoccupation about the future evolution of America. Under this administration, there is a signs of a retreat from involvement in international institutions such as the United Nations, the refusal to recognize the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the rejection of the Kyoto Protocol, the present war in Iraq, as you know, lacks legitimacy in the eyes of almost the whole world. Even most people in Britain and many people in the United States. As a church, we are deeply concerned by an institution where power is often used unaccountably. I think as American Catholics, you have an extremely important prophetic role to play, living in the midst of a society where there is the danger of drifting into increasing unaccountability in the face of the rest of the world. We live in a very dangerous moment. As a church, you may well be called upon to be increasingly countercultural, to stand against the tide in your own lands. If you do this, you may find yourself increasingly under pressure and unpopular. You will be called unpatriotic, as Catholics in Britain were from the time of Henry VIII onwards. To endure, you will need deep links with the wider Catholic Church, the universal communion that includes the poorest and the most powerless. These are your kin in Christ. When the war in Iraq became imminent, the American Dominican Leadership Conference issued car stickers, bumper stickers, saying, "We have family in Iraq." It's a wide preoccupation in the church. At the Synod of the Americas, part of the hope was that there would be much deeper institutional links developed between the churches of North America and South America to give that wider perspective, a wider sense of identity. But I'm afraid, as far as I can gather, and I've always asked about this, both in the North and South America, little's happened. So I think that you will have to be inventive of new institutions, institutional creativity, to actually establish a deeper sense of identity, or to sustain, shall we say, a deeper sense of identity. Secondly, in the World Wide Web, what principally circulates is money. That's the infinite flexible symbol that stands for everything and for nothing. Now, from the beginning of the church, you can see how power and wealth have always been linked. In fact, even the Eucharist, which is the archetypal Christian act of power, was from the beginning tainted by wealth. In 1 Corinthians, Paul complains that the rich come and they take over the Eucharist, and they get drunk on the best wines, while the poor are sitting and drinking sort of weak stuff at the back. For most of the history of the church, it's been the laity trying to get hold of the wealth of the church. It shifted a bit recently. My impression now, it's on the whole, the church trying to get hold of the wealth of the laity.